With the shipments of vaccines underway, pharmaceutical companies have provided us with a reason to see some light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. However, the speed of distribution, the absence of true efficacy data, and review, the difficulties in storage, and the concerns over vaccine acceptance are all challenges in the goal of mass global vaccination. How should governments and regulators deal with these issues and achieve effective cooperation? Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, also offers his assessment of the potential challenges associated with vaccine distribution and strategies to overcome them. Let's take it. In Seoul, I'm joined by Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Mr. Kim, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's wonderful to see you also.
Busy days these days for you, I would assume, because all the vaccines are suggesting to the others that they are reaching the third stage trial and the good results, but so far the data has not been made public, have they?
Yes, these are exciting times by press release. We've seen announcements of vaccine efficacy above 90% for a vaccine from Pfizer, for one from Moderna, and for one from Gamaleya, which is a Russian company. And then we saw an aggregate or average level of efficacy of 70% vaccine from AstraZeneca and Oxford. On the high side, it was 90%. On the lower side, it was 60%. So again, we still are waiting to look at all the data to really understand what is going on.
What is the acceptable percentage?
That's a great question. So the World Health Organization, the US FDA, have used 50% reduction in infection or disease as the target.
How are we going to verify the data provided by various pharmaceutical companies, as long as we know there are enormous amount of commercial interest involved?
So when a company is submitting documentation to a regulatory agency, like the NMPA in China or the US Food and Drug Administration, it has to be very careful. So typically for trials like this, the company has not only looked at the data, but they've actually gone back to double check to make sure that particularly the infection data are correct. And there are ways, that companies can verify the accuracy of reports. And those kinds of things, we call them monitoring visits, are actually very important in ensuring that all research that's being done is being done according to the international standard of quality that regulates clinical trials, vaccine clinical trials in particular.
So far, China has been the earlier ones to work on the vaccine, but the data has not been made public either. Meanwhile, no final result has been made public, at least about the efficiency or efficacy and effectiveness of the vaccines. Tell me more about how do you see the issue?
So we're all waiting for Sinopharm, Sinovac to make their announcements. We know that they've submitted their packages to the regulatory authority in China, but again, we don't know. And it would be one of the things about doing science by press releases that to some extent, the people who study vaccines, who are very concerned about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, would very much like to see data as it's being announced. Now, it can be done several ways, but it helps to assure people that having had access and seen the data, that when we speak on television or to other reporters, that we're being accurate. And that's been a major problem with the rapid announcements that have been made recently.
On the other hand, some argue, well, this is an emergency anyway. I mean, it's an emergency for the world, and therefore we are going to give it, at least at the very beginning, the first responders and also the vulnerable groups. So why don't we, just use it as soon as possible? Why do we still have to, pondering about the data and thinking about the percentage? Let's just use them. What's your response?
My experience has been with the US FDA and Western regulatory authorities, and also now with the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea. And there is a requirement that vaccines be safe and effective. I think that different countries have different approaches, and that, for instance, Sinopharm and Sinovac both have approval for emergency use in China and actually in another country in the world. But this is in the absence of true efficacy data and with some, but not a complete set, of safety data. And, for instance, the US FDA required at least 2 months on the average of safety on all the volunteers in a trial before it will issue emergency use authorization. Different countries have different views on the risks that a regulatory authority is taking if it doesn't look at all the data. And there have been occasions where vaccines have developed side effects that are rare, that weren't necessarily apparent even in the clinical trial that involved tens of thousands of people, but have turned up later. And an absence of regulatory review is one of those things that, at least I think for instance for the US FDA, that was not something that they were willing to do because they consider this to be one of their key responsibilities.
What's going to happen with the next stage, both manufacturing, transporting, and also distribution, as well as vaccination, both within a country and beyond the borders on a global stage? We know this is the hardest question, but they have to be answered in a very efficient way from now on. What's your take?
Yeah, so you hit the two most important questions right on the head. Can we make enough of these vaccines? So maybe 16 billion doses. CEPI, which is a global organization, estimates that it will be 2023 to 2024 before we're able to make enough doses to vaccinate everyone in the world who needs to be vaccinated. And this vaccine can't just be any old vaccine. It should be a vaccine that meets international standards for quality.
Yeah.
So that's a very important part. And then the other part is none of these vaccines is going to have any impact on COVID until we use them in vaccination programs. And so not only do we have to make the vaccine, but we have to actually administer it, which means that you have to get it from, say, Sinopharm to a country where they're going to use it, and then from the airport at that country, out on a truck or a motorcycle to the places where the vaccine is going to be given. And this is an enormous logistical task. Now, there are some things that make it more difficult. For instance, with the new RNA vaccines, they have a requirement for storage at colder temperatures that may make it less practical to use these vaccines in low and middle income countries. It may be fine to use it in the United States or maybe in China or in Western Europe, but taking a vaccine that has to be stored at minus 70 degrees, which is the temperature of dry ice, could be a problem in many parts of the world.
If you look at some specific countries, let's just take the United States as an example, one of the ones that's suffered the most in terms of number of COVID-19. Now, there's going to be a change in administration, and President-elect Mr. Biden suggested that by the middle of the next year, many Americans will have access to the vaccine, and probably the whole population by the end of the year or even before that. Now, how practical is it, given your knowledge about the process from producing to eventual vaccination of the population?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, but the United States has actually pre-ordered over 2 billion doses of vaccine. Now, if you imagine that the population of the United States is about 300 million, and you need 2 doses of vaccine per person, they've ordered vaccine far in excess of their needs. In order to ensure that by the middle of next year, there's ample supply of several different vaccines. I think so having the vaccine supply in the United States may not be the issue. The bigger issue may be acceptability of vaccination. And, I think you've been reading or have seen some publications that are saying that, Americans are very concerned about the safety and efficacy, and that uptake may not be optimal. So I think as public health professionals, and certainly that Dr. Fauci will be there, advocating for vaccine use, because in the failure of political and other social mechanisms to control COVID, a vaccine solution, now hopefully combined with strong emphasis from the incoming administration on the importance of masks and distance and hygiene, in addition to vaccines, they'll actually be able to bring the epidemic under much better control, much better control than they've done to date.
Now, Dr. Kim, when we have the vaccine now, let's just assume they will be eventually approved, quite some of them, and there will be ample supply. Is prevention and control still top priority, or should we just throw them away because we have vaccines and we're safe?
So vaccines should be a part of a comprehensive program of prevention until the point is reached where we are not seeing widespread community transmission of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And we'll only know that as we collect more data. But I'm going to be available to take my vaccine when my time comes. You know, when I'm in the right level of priority, I will take the vaccine, and I'm not going to put away the mask until I'm told to.
But are you the exceptional, or are you a typical person? You know, if you talk to.
No, so I think that this is about messaging. It's about saying that, you know, the vaccine is just a weapon in a war against COVID-19. And like any war, that weapon needs to be used by the people who are going to be vaccinating people around the world, you know, populations at risk. And then we're also going to need a strategy. And the strategy, at least for the time being, will involve continued use of masks and distancing until enough people have been vaccinated so that transmission is no longer a concern.
Dr. Kim, another issue, we have quite a number of vaccines already available. Of course, later the use of vaccines will have to still wait for the regulators to give us the result. But how will these vaccines work, coexist and work in different populations? For example, there's some very practical matters. For example, one person traveled to one country. Does he or she needs to have the vaccination of one kind or another as being regulated by one country or another? And meanwhile, if one have already the vaccine, let's just say of a lower efficacy, but certainly work also, as regulators suggested in that country, and this person traveled to another country, could have access to another vaccine. Should he or she take it or not?
Those are great questions. And you know that in the month after efficacy was first announced, we still haven't come up with a good solution to them. Because you've hit on a key scientific question. You know, we didn't rush, but we moved very quickly through vaccine development. So we didn't necessarily have time to optimize. We've also supported multiple vaccine candidates. So that at any one time, there could be 2, 3, 4 vaccines approved for use in a country. So what is the correct dosing interval? Do we have to give a booster dose? Big question. If you give a booster dose, can you give the same vaccine or should you give a different vaccine? Yeah. So, you know, it's been said that some of the RNA vaccines, the side effects get worse with subsequent doses. So if your symptoms or side effects are worse after the second dose, can you give a third dose? Or do you have to switch then to one of the other vaccines in order to get a maximal immune response? Should we vaccinate people who've already had an infection? So we know that some people who've had documented infections are becoming reinfected. So what are the criteria going to be? Is it dangerous if you've been infected to be vaccinated? All these scientific questions are really, really important to answer. The other practical question that you raised is, how do we document this? So within a country, if you're in the United States and happen to be in San Francisco and get the Pfizer vaccine, is it okay when you're in New York to take the Moderna vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine? We don't know. It probably is. But again, no one's actually really studied it because, you know, the phase 3 trials are designed to answer one question. Right. Does this vaccine protect against COVID-19 disease? It doesn't necessarily begin to answer the other questions that are going to have to be answered in, as a matter of practice, as multiple vaccines are out there. And then the final, I think, section is, how are these vaccines going to work in people who are old, over the age of 75? Or can we vaccinate pregnant women? Can we vaccinate women of childbearing age who intend to get pregnant? How safe is this, in other words? Can we vaccinate people with diseases that would decrease their immune response, such as people with HIV/AIDS who are on treatment or who are not being treated or suboptimally treated? All of these questions have to be answered. They weren't in the first set of questions, but they're going to be important as we vaccinate the 8 billion people who live on planet Earth. And, you know, the important additional question has to do with one that you already raised, which is around real-world evidence. How is this vaccine going to work? How are these vaccines going to work? When we start to vaccinate entire populations and not just 30,000 people in a clinical trial where half get vaccine and half get placebo, and the study nurses and doctors follow people very, very closely to the very end of the trial. You know, that's not going to happen when we're in the real world. So how do we do these things practically? And then finally, how does one country verify that another country's vaccination document is actually correct?
Mm-hmm.
You know, will the little yellow WHO immunization folder be sufficient? Or will there be some question raised about, you know, can you forge signatures or forge vaccine signatures on a paper document?
Right.
Those are all very important questions that countries will have to answer internally for their own purposes, and then internationally as people from China want to travel to, you know, the United States or, you know, to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of requirements are there going to be, and how do you verify them? Very, very important questions.
Because of good or comparatively good prevention and control measures so far, I'm talking about so far because anything could happen. People here in China, for example, might ask, do we still need to have vaccines? Because we have pretty good control already, sporadic cases only. One could argue about Japan and South Korea, even though there are sometimes a rebound of cases. So do we need that urgently, given all of the uncertainties, Dr. Kim, you scientifically explained to us earlier? Do we need to have vaccines in a hurry mode, or shall we wait until many of the dust being settled before we have it?
Another great question. So, you know, right now we have 2 months worth of safety data and 2 months worth of efficacy data, of evidence of protection against disease.
Right.
Do we need more? Yes. Can that information be collected in real time and reported back? I think it will have to be. South Korea, China, and Japan, you know, for all their success at controlling COVID, actually have a separate problem. They still have substantial numbers of people who are not infected, who are what we call naive. Mm-hmm. And naive people are at particular risk because they're the ones who can do asymptomatic spread. Mm-hmm. So as I think the experience in South Korea tells us, and Japan as well, it doesn't take much of undocumented spread to create a real crisis. A crisis where, you know, you could be doing tens of thousands, maybe 50,000 new tests a day, COVID-19 diagnostic tests, in order to try to get control or to help to understand a pandemic. So I think that given the implications, you know, as Korea is now limiting access to restaurants and gyms and bars and other things, mm-hmm. as the level in Seoul has been increased, you know, I think the realization that Korea still has a substantial, I mean, probably 99% of the Korean population is still potentially at risk for infection, mm-hmm. and similar numbers in China. So as vaccines are available, they should be used. And, you know, the governments will prioritize. They'll prioritize people who are older. They'll prioritize healthcare workers. Yeah. They need to do this. I mean, as I think China showed and Korea showed very well, preparation and thinking in advance about the problems before they develop really pays off in the end, because you never know when COVID-19 is going to find a weak point in our defenses. I mean, it's done that over and over again. In certain countries, the awareness about the vaccines, the trust toward the authorities and toward the medical community might not be as high in some of the other countries. And therefore, vaccines in some countries have to be optional. The rest of the world look at this situation and say, when we are all taking the vaccines, you guys are saying, well, it's optional. Then you will become the weak point, and therefore none of us will be safe. So why should we still have the vaccines anyway? Dr. Kim, how do you see this global governance issue involved very urgently, I would assume, about vaccines in front of all of us? Consistent messaging from the top of the multilateral organizations, from the World Health Organization, from the United Nations, through the various economic groups like ASEAN and APEC, and you know, through the G7 and the G20. The messaging from the top needs to be consistent. We also need to get out in front with the science. You know, unfortunately, we have a successful publication of a press release. We still haven't seen the data, and at the same time, the people who are opposed to vaccination are making stories and putting misinformation onto the internet and feeding misinformation to people all over the world. So when we have the information, we'll be much better armed, and we should plan now to have a very intense amount of communication around the safety and efficacy of the vaccines when the data are available. And nationally, within individual countries, leaders are going to have to work to make a very consistent, very strong message about the need for vaccination in order not to only to stabilize their countries, the society, the economy, but in also as well to begin normal activities with regard to other countries. Because you're absolutely right. No one wants to carry on trade or allow in people from a country that is not following the rules. And so I think we're going to need very strong advocacy. We're going to need unity among countries around the world about the need to implement COVID-19 vaccination, the need to provide vaccines equitably to countries around the world.
Wonderful point, as always. Dr. Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. That's all the time we have for today. A whole series of discussions about vaccines for COVID-19. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching.